the honor to preside over this meeting, to be the chair of CEEPC this year. Happy second day of spring. This is the moment to move decisively forward in everything that is important to us.
Yeah, I think the road is way super still on tomorrow.
I hear some noise around. If people can mute themselves. So until we have confirmation that we have a quorum and we can proceed with the formal committee proceedings, I would like to invite new members to introduce themselves. So just please unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Hey, I guess I'll go first. My name is Al Carr, and I am a new member of CEEPC, but because here at CEEPC we believe in recycling, I'm actually someone who previously served on CEEPC when I was a member of the House of Delegates. So in my current capacity, I am working at the District of Columbia Department of Energy and Environment on renewable energy and clean transportation. Good to see a lot of my friends here.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. I believe the first thing in the triple R's that I learned early in my life, the first was for reuse. So that's way more than a recycle. I think this is the best thing we can do with great minds and great people who work on our line of work. Who goes next?
Well, I'm happy to. I'm Paul Pinsky. I'm the new director of Maryland's Energy Administration. I came from the Maryland State Senate, where I served for 28 years. And I was the sponsor of the Climate Solutions Now Act last year, which calls for a 60% reduction by 2031. So the governor has tapped me to lead his energy administration and move towards clean energy. So thank you for the invitation.
Awesome, Mr. Pinsky. Welcome. Who would like to go next?
I will jump in since it's Maryland morning, clearly, following former Senator Pinsky and former Delegate Carr. My name is Evan Glass. I'm an at-large member of the Montgomery County Council, and I have the honor of serving as president of the council this year and also chair of the Transportation and Environment Committee. So I know I am in very good company with all of you and look forward to working with you throughout this term.
Excellent, Mr. Glass. Thank you. Who would go next from our?
I'm going to bring it to Virginia. I'm Julie Rosenberg, and I am on the board of the Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions, which is based in Northern Virginia, but we actually have a Montgomery County hub, and I lead the Arlington County hub. And before doing this, I had a very long professional career at the Environmental Protection Agency, and I crossed paths with many of you because I led for about 20 years our state and local climate and energy solutions program, where we develop a lot of tools and information resources to help local governments develop their energy and climate strategies.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenberg. Welcome. We have two more new members. Is there anybody present?
Hi, I am a new member. My name's Kate Doyle-Feingold. I'm on the City Council at City of Fairfax, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Councilmember Feingold, welcome.
Thank you.
And we have one more new member from Prince George's County, Jolene Ivey. She may not have joined yet. So how are we doing with quorum, Ms. Davis?
Chair Karantonis, we have a quorum. We are still working on re-engaging the live stream, but we have a quorum.
Okay, great. So good morning, everybody. We have a quorum, and so we can start with our formal proceedings as a committee. Welcome to the March virtual meeting of the Climate, Energy, and Environment Policy Committee. Today, our committee will be taking action on a proposal to update the environmental justice toolkit, which I think it's an exciting topic to discuss and take action. We're also hearing from COG and the ICLEI staff on Race to Zero, a global movement to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And we will hear also about local examples on climate goals, plans, and implementation. I do want to note that we did receive a public comment letter related to the topics that we will be covering today, especially the environmental justice and climate goals topics. This letter from Mr. Auburn has been posted to your meeting materials, and it is available online, and staff will be dropping a link if you haven't done so already. Is that accurate? Great. So the first item of committee business is to adopt our meeting summary from CEEPC's November meeting. Motions and seconds is there. I hope that you had the opportunity to see that summary. If you have any questions or amendments, please let me know. And now I will ask for a motion to approve.
We have a motion from Cindy.
Okay, is it seconded?
Second, this is Sarah Bagley.
Excellent. So it's good morning, Mrs. Bagley. It's moved and seconded. If there are any changes, this is the moment to say so. If not, I will ask for yeas and nays. So all in the favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Any abstentions? Thank you. So these notes, the summary is approved. So we have introduced the new members. Ms. Glass is here. Ms. Jolene Ivy from Georges County hasn't joined yet. At least I don't see her in the roster. Ms. Feingold from the city of Fairfax, welcome. Mr. Carr, Mr. Pinsky from the Maryland Energy Administration, Ms. Rosenberg from the Faith Alliance, and if there are any new members who I haven't mentioned, please, this is a moment to introduce yourselves, and you're all welcome. So then, seeing that there is no new member joining, let's go ahead with our agenda, committee business and updates. So Ms. Davis is going to briefly touch base on what new members need. Let me see if we have any update from the Air and Climate Public Advisory Committee, ACPAC.
Chair Karantonis, before we do the ACPAC proposal, just quickly wanted to remind everyone of how we work here at CEEPC, and particularly for our new members here. Tim, if you could pull the presentation up really quickly. But I'm just going to start through with it because it's really brief here. Region Forward is our long-term and common vision for a more prosperous, accessible, livable, and sustainable future. And equity has been added that so we can have an equitable future for all of our area residents. And so all the work here at COG touches on those topics and works towards meeting that Region Forward vision. And that includes what we do here at CEEPC. So Tim, you can go a couple slides down. So we have 3 boards here at CEEPC, and so I think this is a tricky one about how is our organizational structure land again. And so we have the Transportation Planning Board, we have the Metropolitan Washington Air Quality Committee, or MWAC, and we have the COG Board of Directors. So those are our 3 separate boards, and there are 4 core policy committees that report up and advise the board. And CEEPC, Climate, Energy, and Environment Policy Committee, is one of those committees. Next slide, please. And your role is to provide leadership on climate change and the various areas of energy, green building, fuels, solid waste, and recycling issues that fall underneath that umbrella. And what we do here is we work together to support our local communities in meeting our common goals. The regional goal is for a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and 80% by 2050, and to work towards becoming a climate resilient region. And all of our work here together is voluntary, and we work to build an ecosystem of support for scaled up action. Next slide, please. Now here's your support system to CEEPC. You are the policy and advisory committee here, and you have long-standing committees that support the implementation of this work. So we have the local government recycling and solid waste managers working towards increasing the recycling rate and zero waste initiatives in the region. We have a legislative committee of a handful of elected officials from this group that work during the state legislative seasons to comment on proposed bills that relate to our work and support our goals. We have our local government energy and sustainability managers. Part of our BAC committee is the short term for that group, working to support technical energy efficiency, renewable energy related work in your communities. We have a public advisory committee on air and climate that advises you, and we have public representatives from across Northern Virginia, DC, and Maryland on this group. And then your local foresters are represented on the tree canopy subcommittee, working to increase tree canopy and carbon sequestration in the region. That's a part of our goals. And the new group that you'll hear more about later in this agenda item is the Regional Electric Vehicle Deployment Working Group, or REVD. That's what we're calling it. So next slide. You are our biggest committee here at COG, one of the biggest committees for sure, and that was designed on purpose. Local governments can't, solve the climate program alone. We need cross-sectoral and multi-sectoral actions here, and the board recognized that in creating you. So we have all the local government representation, as well as our state energy, environment, and transportation agencies. We have other federal and regional agencies represented, our utilities, environmental, business, and academic communities, and of course, our public advisors. Next slide, please. For the voting quorum, we look for a third of our voting members or alternates to be present in order to do a vote. And last slide is the support system of staff that you have here. I'm sort of your first line of defense here, point of contact for CEEPC, but you also have Conti, Jeff, Leah, Tim, and Robert on our team supporting the work here at CEEPC. And with that, I'll stop there, and thank you for letting me introduce or reintroduce ourselves and the committee to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davis, and apologies for going too fast on that item. I honestly was under-caffeinated enough to forget that you had this presentation. That's very, very important and very useful. And it's you're not only the first line of defense, but you are most importantly the first line of advice, and that's very important. Does any of our new or already experienced member have any questions about what Ms. Davis just summarized for us? I don't hear nothing, but I think that it's important. I think we have this this presentation is also somewhere online, right? In the meeting minutes. So it's a good thing to have an access to that from time to time. So moving ahead to our item that that's an action item on our agenda. The ACPAC, the Air and Climate Public Advisory Committee, will present a proposal to update the Environmental Justice Toolkit. Originally, this toolkit was originally developed in 2017, and so we will hear about the update. Era Pandia will represent the committee, the ACPAC, and she will present the Environmental Justice Tool proposal. And CEEPC will be asked to approve the work to move forward. So, Ms. Pandia, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and Chair Karen Tonis. This is Leah Boggs from COG staff. I send my apologies from Chair Pandia. She was unable to participate in this morning's meeting. Duty calls from work, so I send her. I relay her apologies. So I will be doing the presentation today.
Excellent, thank you.
And so thank you, Tim, for bringing the presentation up. Again, this morning, we bring to you a proposal to update the 2017 Environmental Justice Toolkit. You should have a 2-page document that provides some details for you. I will brief you on the new scope and objectives of the update, but first I'll do a quick review of the 2017 toolkit. So next slide, please. Slide 2. Thank you. And in brief, the 2017 toolkit was a pivotal sort of publication led by ACPAC. The objectives was to support greater awareness of the impacts decision makers have on our communities in the region and aid them in active engagement with communities that are concerned with environmental planning and policy decisions. So the 2017 toolkit included 9 approaches intended to build EJ capacity and to assist COG staff, our local jurisdictions, and stakeholders to sort of set the direction for inclusion and equity in all our air quality, energy, and climate planning and policy decisions. Next slide, please. And so the new version of the toolkit, we see those 9 elements as theoretical approaches. And when I say we, meaning the committee, ACPAC. And so those 9 approaches were theoretical approaches to environmental justice. And we think it's important for us to move forward with from theoretical to implementation in the new update. So the objective of the update remains to build capacity, but we need to improve the utility and relevance of the toolkit. It has been used in some degree, but we like to increase it, the use of the toolkit, and we think that would, by doing that or moving from theoretical to practice, we would engage equity in a more effective manner. And by doing that, we like to include some practical examples in the toolkit, best practices and recommendations. And in addition to an internal review and input from COG policy and technical committees, we'd like to include external review from grassroots organizations in the region to ensure relevancy. And so you have examples of that in the 2-pager. This was not a part of the review process of the 2017 toolkit. And so we think this will make it, as I mentioned, more effective to benefit the target communities. And other elements of the toolkit includes obviously a glossary of definitions, which was included in the 2017 toolkit, but those are examples there like distributional equity and climate justice was not included in the toolkit. So we'll include more relevant definitions and terms into the toolkit. And so also included in examples would be funding mechanisms and recommendations that we would closely align with the chief equity officers within the COG structural system here. And next slide, please. So here is the timeline. MWAC, the other policy committee, Metropolitan Washington Air Quality Committee, approved the proposal last month. And today we're asking for CEEPC's approval to move forward with an update of the toolkit. And with your approval today, assuming that we get it today, we'll move forward with the work. The expected timeline for completion of the new version would be fall 2024. This is an aggressive timeline for the committee. The 2017 toolkit took close to 2 years to complete, and the committee at that time was meeting on a once-a-month schedule. So again, this is an aggressive timeline for us as we meet every other month, so 6 times a year. We do have a small subcommittee of 2 members and COG staff. So we're hoping that we can get additional support, perhaps through consultant support that would support the work of the update. We are looking internally in terms of COG staff is looking internally to pursue getting consultant support on the new toolkit. And so with that, I will turn it back over to the chair to ask for approval on the proposal to move forward with the update.
Thank you, Mrs. Boggs. Just to make clear, this is a proposal to go ahead with an update of the toolkit. So it's not the toolkit itself, of course. It's a proposal to start with this very important, in my opinion, work that, as Ms. Boggs mentioned, it's a lot of work, and it took 2 years, you said, to get the first one. I hope that we learned a lot in the process until now, and we'll add a lot of things. I intend to be in favor of that. Just for before we open for discussion, I wanted to make sure to remind members how the voting procedure will be. We took a roll call earlier and we established that we have a quorum, which I hope is still the case, Ms. Davis. If not, let me know. First and second motions can be verbal or in the chat box. The way we will be voting is that if you say nothing, it will count as a yes vote. Noes and abstentions can be submitted verbally or in the chat box. So before I open for discussion, is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve?
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Is there a second?
Second.
Oh, Mr. Bala, thank you so much. So is there now any discussions? Question for Mrs. Boggs, discussion on the item.
Leah, I'm aware of some of the work that's being done by the Chesapeake Bay program, and I know Heidi Bonifant from COG is involved in that, and that the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay has also been working on some glossaries and some other work. Are you collaborating with any other organizations on this to help streamline your efforts?
Well, that would certainly be a part of the process. Our first iteration of the 2017 toolkit, we did collaborate or get input from internal COG organizations or COG committees. So we certainly incorporate existing or in progress work on environmental justice. So we work internally with Heidi in the Chesapeake Bay on incorporating their work in environmental justice, and as well as what's going on in our transportation TPP. They have an environmental justice initiative that they're working on. In fact, I think it was just a presentation last week on their work. So we would incorporate all of that as much as possible.
Great. Are there other questions or comments?
I have a question.
Sure,
I'm
go
Jolene.
ahead.
I'm Jolene Ivy. I'm on the Prince George's County Council. I missed the very beginning because I just couldn't seem to log on.
Welcome. You're a new member. So
Yes, I am. So thank you so much. And I'm curious because I'm new. I don't know what you've already done or who you've been talking to. And I wanted to see if you've been including Dr. Jacoby Wilson from the University of Maryland. He's got an air quality monitoring program he's been working on, and he's been a leader in environmental justice in Prince George's County. So I just wanted to make sure that he's a part of this.
Well, Dr. Jacoby Wilson presented to the committee last year, actually, on his work. So we are very familiar with Dr. Jacoby Wilson.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much.
We also engaged Dr. Wilson as well as a number of other community organizations that work on environmental justice and equity issues during the first development of the toolkit, but that was 5 to 7 years ago.
I will recognize next Mr. Pinsky. You are muted, Mr. Pinsky. Mr. Pinsky, please unmute yourself. We cannot hear you. Right. Yeah.
As the two previous speakers, I think you want to avoid reinventing the wheel. There have been a number of tools out there. Obviously, Dr. Wilson has an EJ tool for Maryland that he's developed. I know the feds have one, either EPA or DOE have one. Having to start afresh might not be the most efficient and effective way. And so I think if there were one of the existing tools we could simply adapt for the COG and the metropolitan area, it might cut the time and not need to do two years of work to develop it. So I think we should gather those existing tools that do exist and try to work off of them rather than start afresh.
Thank you, Mr. Pinsky. On to recognize Mr. Bala.
Yes, thank you. So when this was first done, it was cutting edge and there wasn't anything else. So there may now be, and so I support Mr. Pinsky's comment, but I also wanted to add in terms of following up on Shannon's comment about coordination. Last week, the Transportation Planning Board announced that they were going to take a look at their environmental justice criteria. Conti would be better to speak to this off either now or offline, you know, but that's another area of coordination that I think is important. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or responses to the comments or other comments?
We had a question in the chat box from member Dan Scleroux.
Okay.
I don't know if you wanted to speak up, Dan, or.
Yeah, thank you very much for recognition. I just tried to find out whether the proposed updates will include the latest state-specific information with respect to the regulatory and policy frameworks we're working on across the 3 jurisdictions, or within each of the 3 jurisdictions, rather.
Well, we are just in the beginning stages of developing the components of the toolkit. So all of your suggestions, we will be taking in consideration. So certainly what Mr. Scleroux just suggested is an appropriate inclusion into the toolkit.
Excellent. So I don't see if there are any other comments or questions. And if there are none, I would like to move to go ahead and vote on Mrs. Moore's motion to approve, second by Mr. Bala. So please, who is in favor, please say silent. We only need to collect nays and abstentions, which can be expressed here, or they can be just type your nay or abstention in the chat. So are there any nays? Are there any abstentions? I see none. Therefore, Ms. Boggs, thank you. And you have the head nod of this committee to go ahead and update the toolbox. And I think that these were personally, if I may add, very helpful comments on work that has been already accruing across the region. And I think that they will be of great utility for the effort that we have ahead of us. So on to our next committee business. Virginia Burke, chair of the Regional Electric Vehicle Deployment REVD Working Group that just started. I believe it was the 19th, right, of March, the first meeting. It's a new subcommittee of CEEPC, as we saw in the presentation of Ms. Davis earlier. Are there any? So we want to hear from this committee a brief overview to see how the start was and hear the update.
Good morning.
So the floor is yours.
Jump in. Thank you.
Yes.
Virginia Burke with the Maryland Department of Transportation, and thank you to being invited just to give this brief update on the beginning of the regional, REVD, Regional EV Deployment Working Group. So my name is Virginia Burke. I'm in the Secretary's Office of MDOT. We were delighted to be invited to chair the working group for its first year. And actually the first meeting was the 16th, not the 19th, but it's okay, last week. And the next meeting is 2 months later, May 18. Good start. We had lots of lively conversation, lots of questions. I think we had about 71 people. I think I noticed at one point on the call. This group, so this was its first meetings, and we spent a bit of time on a couple of agenda items. First of all, priorities for the first year and key work deliverables that'll be done in that year. Of the work products, a significant one of intending to be very useful to the member jurisdictions is an EV clearinghouse. So COG staff has set that up, stood that up on, it's an online platform. It's accessible through the website. Key resources are posted there, and I think continuing to be developed and posted. So useful resources include EV grants and funding, EV incentives, EV laws and regulations, a charging station locator map, an interactive map, and finally, local plans addressing EV infrastructure. So this is a work group really intending to sort of share resources and collaborate and develop sort of best practices. Also under development as a work product in the first year is an EV ready checklist. And so this would be something that member jurisdictions could use as they were beginning to think about where should infrastructure be deployed and what's involved, what do we do first and second, what do we need to think about. So the clearinghouse and the checklist, both a lot of conversation and commentary around those two work products. And then finally, the second half of the meeting was devoted to the NEVI plans of the three jurisdictions. So that's Maryland, Virginia, and the district. And the NEVI plans, that's the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure plans. That's become shorthand for the whole bundle of federal resources coming out through the IIJA. The three jurisdictions talked about the NEVI plans, which each had to complete, which is sort of the first piece of the NEVI funding, and that is for deployment of the formula funds that goes through the two DOTs and the district. And then we also talked about what we consider the NEVI discretionary funding, which had been information about that had been released all of 2 days before the meeting. It was brand new. None of us have quite wrapped our arms around it yet, but we talked about it anyway. The NEVI discretionary funding is called the CFI, or Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grant Program, and that is distinct from the NEVI formula funds in that it's much more widely accessible. So any government jurisdiction pretty much can apply for the NEVI discretionary funding, as can the states. So the similarity between the discretionary and the formula is they adhere to the same federal minimum standards and requirements, and that's a very important thing when it comes to implementing infrastructure projects. Anyway, so between NEVI formula funding and NEVI discretionary funding, again, lots to say, lots to know, and we will continue, obviously, with our work. And that is about all I had prepared to say today.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Burke. So are there any, I find all of this extremely stimulating and, you know, in my head generating already thousands of questions that I'm not going to unload here, but let's see if our fellow committee members have one. Mr. Carr, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks for that update about the Regional EV Working Group. Just one thing I wanted to throw out there too. The group, I read a report by an organization called WRI that was from 2021, where they talk about this idea of pole-mounted charges. That's putting chargers either on metal streetlight poles or wood utility poles. Apparently, this is something that's being done in some places. Los Angeles seems to be taking the lead on that, and I didn't know if there was anywhere in the DMV where there were efforts towards pole-mounted chargers, either for charging electric vehicles or charging bikes and scooters.
Ms. Burke, you are muted.
I can give an answer if that's appropriate at this point.
Please.
Yes, only to say, yes, the Los Angeles example, lots of us are watching that one. As far as I know, Montgomery County has tried some things more about curbside charging. And this, of course, is such an important answer, I suppose, to the fact that many EV drivers charge at their homes. And if they have a garage and a driveway available to them, then that's an immediately easy thing to do. And so who's left out of that ability is anyone who's a townhouse community or a condo or an apartment, or some of the older communities, more dense, think Baltimore row house communities. And so therefore the work towards either allow poolside for pole charging or curb charging. There's significant work being tried there. It has not, I don't think, been implemented so successfully that it's easy to replicate everywhere now. I think my thought would be, because I know Montgomery County has recently been trying some things, is that we actually explore that with Montgomery rather than me at MDOT trying to characterize what Montgomery is or is not doing. But I know they had tried something. I know Baltimore City had also tried and actually walked away from it, abandoned it. There were so many issues with legalities and access that made it very difficult. But it's a continually evolving sort of area of work. So appreciate the question.
Thank you, Mrs. Burke. I would recognize next Mr. Glass and then on to Mr. Pinsky. Mr. Glass, go ahead.
Sure. Well, so I'll provide some greater context as to what Montgomery County is doing. So thank you for recognizing our efforts, Ms. Burke. Last year, or over the last 2 years, the county actually changed one of our laws that allows for curbside EV charging stations on residential property in the right of way. So that is one of the tangible steps that we've taken, allowing people to put personal property, AKA their own charging stations, on the right of way, where I don't think many jurisdictions allow any personal property to be. The question I raised then, this might be the direction that you were alluding, Ms. Burke, is during that work session, I asked about any conflicts. What happens if a neighbor is charging on your charging station, right? And some of the neighborhood concerns that might arise. I was told by staff that we don't want to really focus on that right now. We want to change the law to facilitate these necessary updates. And if there are instances that need addressing in the future, we will take that up. But I see where this is going, right? As we continue making progress, and any information that you have, lessons learned from other jurisdictions, and I'm not familiar with what Baltimore tried or potentially possibly abandoned, but I think it would be informative for all of us to have eyes wide open as we work towards this effort.
Thank you, Mr. Glass, for the comment. Fascinating. Mr. Pinsky and next, Ms. Dybala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A week ago, actually last Monday, Maryland Governor Moore announced that Maryland would be joining California's Clean Car 2 initiative, which will require by 2035 all new car sales to be ZEV. One, I just wanted to share that, and to encourage other members, Virginia and I'm not sure DC, to also consider joining the Clean Car 2 as well. The sooner more states join and the waiver is approved by the federal government, the more the industry is going to change. So we've moved in that direction. We were one of the first signers for the Clean Car 1 in terms of mileage, and the Clean Car 2 that has been initiated by California. We joined with 16 or 17 other states. So I would encourage any other member states, including DC, and I'm not sure if they've joined or not yet, to join that initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pinsky. Ms. Dybala.
Just very briefly, Tacoma Park has also experimented with permits to for residents to put a charger on the public right of way in front of their home if they don't have a driveway, which is true for a lot of Tacoma Park residents. We haven't solved the other thorny issue, and I'm not sure we've solved it, but we have some experience. The other thorny issue I want to bring up is multifamily buildings and how that works out as something for the group to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bala. Living in a multifamily building, I'm very interested in the solutions. Miss Ivy.
Hi, thanks so much. Prince George's County Council last June, we had a bill passed and signed into law. It was CB 15, 2022, and it requires that we have any new construction with a garage, carport, or driveway, including single-family townhouses, and 3-family and conversion of single-family detached dwellings. So we also have multifamily. So we're requiring level 2 charging in most places that are built new.
Ms. Ivy, can I ask you, what is the percentage of cars served, or what is the compulsory delivery there?
I can go back and check and report that at the next meeting. I don't remember all the details. That's probably all I remember from last June. But I remember robust discussion and enthusiastic support of the bill.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Ms. Burke and the work of the Regional Electric Vehicle Deployment Working Group? That's excellent. I have a last one, Ms. Burke. So the clearinghouse primarily will be, it's an information clearinghouse, primarily will be collecting best practices, plans, and implementation experiences from our regional jurisdictions, but also on the national level, right? Oh, not everything, but maybe relevant or interesting vectors, aspects, legislation that should be kind of on our radar screen. Is that more or less something we should expect from the clearinghouse?
I'm going to direct that question over to Maya.
Okay.
Yeah, we are compiling a lot of national resources and best practices, policy templates, and whatnot. We do have a lot of great examples of plans and programs and legislation from the region. So we want to make sure that everybody knows what's happening in this region and how we're advancing it. But we definitely want to also make sure that we're not missing out on aggressive or advanced practices from elsewhere as well.
Thank you. Now I see that I'm 5 minutes behind on my timeline. Next on our agenda, thank you for all this very interesting conversation, though, is hearing about Race to Zero, or how our local and regional goals compare to it, and best practices in the areas of clean electricity, decarbonization, electrification of buildings, and transportation, which is a very nice segue to what we have been just discussing. We'll have questions, and when both speakers have presented. Maya, the floor is yours for this.
Thank you, Chair. And for new members, I promise this isn't normal. You don't have to hear from me all the time. But really quickly, in setting up for the conversation about the sort of national and global Race to Zero initiatives, we wanted to just take a moment to share the climate goals and high impact areas of action that are happening in our region, so that we can kind of clearly see how our work compares to some of the national and global initiatives. Next slide, please. So when COG and many of our local governments in the region were first adopting climate goals, man, close to 20 years ago now, we discussed and moved in the same direction together of adopting goals for instance, like 20% by 2020 and 80% by 2050. And then in more recent years, we've been moving together again, adopting 50% by 2030 goals. And for the longer term, many of you moved beyond the 80% by 2050 and adopted carbon neutrality goals. And so the Race to Zero generally sets a 50% by 2030 goal and a net zero carbon emissions by 2050 goal, but it also calls for science-based targets, which could mean more aggressive goals. So Angie, who's going to talk after me, is going to go more into that detail. But generally, this slide, we wanted to share where our various goals are and how they compare to the Race to Zero. Next slide, please. Many of you have seen this before, but just as a reminder and for our new folks, these are the high impact action areas that we have in our region and as part of our regional climate and energy action plan to meet the 50% by 2030 goals. And so essentially what this chart is showing is the need to push towards the zeros: zero carbon or carbon neutral grid, zero energy buildings, zero emission vehicles, and zero waste. Our local climate plans also focus on these areas. They may have a tad bit different name or wording. For instance, clean electricity could be clean energy, energy supply, renewables, buildings, transportation, waste. These are the general sectors that we're talking about here. And clean electricity, the red section of this graph, it makes such a big impact in our region because of the state renewable portfolio standards. And so DC has 100% by 2032 goal. Maryland is 50% by 2030. Virginia gets to about 30% around 2030, and then 100% in the 2045 to 2050 range. And this plan also calls and points out how it's important for the local communities to support the states in meeting the RPS goals. Later in this meeting, we'll hear from Frederick and Loudoun County and on some of their high impact areas in their new plans. But we just wanted to take a minute here to highlight some high impact areas and examples from a few of our jurisdictions in the region. So next slide, please. So we know the district is working to decarbonize its energy supply by deploying solar, engaging residents, and collaborating with local partners to modernize the grid. But something I wanted to point out here that we might tend to forget sometimes or not put it as high on the list as the RPS standards, but it's important to support the workforce to enable the local market to flourish. And so in the first 5 years of the SolarWorks DC program, 288 residents were trained in this field. I also wanted to highlight another example that you all may or may not be aware of, but the DCSEU had a low-income decarbonization pilot program during the pandemic, mostly 2020. And they were able to complete 10 single-family home retrofits. They were doing heat pumps, LED lights, air sealing, electric stoves, weatherization, smart thermostats, these different types of strategies to essentially electrify low-income homes and solarize low-income homes. And so where they went from this pilot was to, from there, take those lessons learned and focus on an affordable housing retrofit accelerator. And so now they're working with affordable multifamily residential building owners to support their efforts to comply with the building energy performance standards and ensure these low-income homes are getting access to energy audits, technical assistance, financial assistance, and there's about 140 properties that they're trying to work with through this program. And of course, we're all aware of the Capital Bike Share program and the work to expand on that. Next slide, please. City of Alexandria has their draft strategy out and is working on finalizing that for their update of their climate plan. And so just wanted to highlight a few things from their recent efforts. And the majority of their government operations energy use comes from renewable energy credits. They also updated their green building policy a few years ago so that all new public development is required to achieve net zero energy. And many of you have heard that the DASH bus system operates 14 battery electric buses as part of their transition to 100% zero emission bus fleet. So in getting these 14 buses and where they're at now, they're through their sort of phase 1 planning, and they're working on their zero emission bus implementation study phase 2 and a facility expansion pre-design to support the remainder of the fleet's transition to zero emission vehicles by 2035. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'd like to highlight Montgomery County. They just had their quarterly progress report come out not too long ago. And they have a lot of great solar, community solar projects that also support low income participation in those projects. This one in particular, I just wanted to highlight because I'm not sure everyone's aware of it. At the 6 megawatt project at the Oaks landfill that is supposed to come online this month from my understanding. So that's exciting news. Also wanted to remind you all of the comprehensive building decarbonization legislation for new buildings to be all electric by the end of 2026 and beyond. And then the Green Bank is also, and it has a partnership with General Motors to support EV charging infrastructure deployment in affordable multifamily buildings. And I think this program is a great example of how to engage with the multifamily properties. Also, when we first think of like our Green Banks and our CEEPC programs and these financing programs that were mainly set up for energy efficiency, renewable energy projects, electric vehicle charging infrastructure might not be top of mind on that, but many of these programs do support electric vehicle infrastructure deployment as well. And with that, I'll stop there. I hope that sharing these goals and examples gives you a taste of the policies and actions that our local members are taking to decarbonize their building and transportation in the region. And now that we've touched on this local perspective, I'd like to pass it to Angie to give the broader national and global perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Maya. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to our distinguished chair and members of this committee. Thank you so much for your service here. It's incredibly important. And I'm happy to be here today as part of Maya's team. She showed you the schematic of her team, but Ickley is very much in the background, helping to support the great work that she is doing there. Next slide, please. So why are we here today? We want to talk a bit about the global need to reduce our emissions in half, a 50% reduction globally by 2030, and the necessity to reach zero emissions by 2050 in order to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement target, which is to hold global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius, based on a comparison to pre-industrial levels. Next slide. So a little bit about Ickley. We are a global network. We were kind of first out of the box in terms of being a city, local, regional government network to support this work globally. We do have a 5-pathway framework. I'm going to touch today specifically on the low emissions development pathway, but we also work with communities around nature-based solutions, resilience, the equity and people-centered pathway, as well as circular economy. Next slide. We know how important local governments are and regional governments, the essential nature of the work that you do in order to achieve these global goals. I really want to commend Maya, Jeff, and the team for the work that they do as a regional body. I think the easy part, if there is an easy part, to achieving these goals is the baselining of greenhouse gas emissions, the analysis of targets, developing strategies. The really difficult part is the governance part. Engaging stakeholders and getting folks on board to move forward collectively. And MWCOG does that really better than any other regional government across the United States. So kudos to all of you for being a part of this work. Next slide. Because we are a network, we have the opportunity to share these great strategies and to bring best-in-class solutions to others that we are working with. In addition to the Metro Washington COG, some of the local governments within the region have also joined ICLEI as active members to get a little bit deeper level of support, and we appreciate that opportunity. We're able to bring those peer sharing examples that Mr. Carr mentioned, not only from around the ICLEI USA network, but also globally. Next slide. So on the race to zero, we know that there are many co-benefits. This work towards getting to a maximum 1.5 degrees will, of course, also provide clean air, job creation, opportunities for the future, and attract investments and innovation to our communities. Next slide. So the Race to Zero is a global campaign which was established at the United Nations by the Climate Champions in June of 2022. Many of you will recognize the logo here of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. Your region has been recognized by GCOM as having met their requirements in terms of greenhouse gas inventory, target setting, and mitigation strategies. And so congratulations to all of you again for being a leader in regional action. Next slide. Here in the region, those that have actually signed on as a commitment to the Race to Zero include these 3 communities. Now this list was just updated in October of 2022, so apologies to anyone who may have signed on since then. Again, the signatory piece is really a recognition opportunity. Obviously, many, if not all of you in the region are taking on these principles at the local level. Next slide. So let's get into some of the general principles about the Race to Zero. It used to be that at ICLEI we would support a local or regional government to set whatever target they felt was best for their region. And we didn't have a lot of guidance to say what is the right target to set. Back in 2020, the ICLEI Global Offices, World Resources Institute, C40 cities came together and developed a science-based target methodology, an SBT, science-based target methodology, to say at what level would local and regional governments need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to be on a path to hitting globally zero emissions by 2050. We didn't have the ability to provide that type of analysis previous to 2020. And so what we see is a number of goals around the country that are 20% by 2020, 50% by 2080, those sorts of things. So now we have the ability to provide communities with a science-based target to let you know where you need to be in order to hit that zero by 2050. So we, as a principle, say that it is critical to have a 2030 science-based target so that you're on the path to zero emissions by 2050. We know that there are rapidly changing trends. I think one of the most important changes that we've seen in the last 2 years has been federal funding. We know that all of the local and regional governments and state governments across the country are really trying to get their arms around the many, many opportunities that are available through the IIJA or the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's a great thing, but it's also something that we have to build into our strategies and be mindful of as we move forward. We do include a holistic approach, including health, resilience, and equity. And this opportunity for regional, state, and utility collaboration, of course, is quite important. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about the science-based targets. I want to dive into this just a little bit deeper. As you know, the national government here in the US, our federal government through the Biden administration has set a 50 to 52% reduction target in our nationally determined contribution, which gets fed up into the UN's global climate framework called the UNFCCC, and that's great. However, the science-based target methodology looks at the Human Development Index for our nation as well as other nations to say, if we as the United States are hitting a 50% reduction by 2030, how does that impact a global by zero 2050 goal? And what we know is that there are nations that are continuing to develop. India, for example, now the largest nation by population on the globe, only 6% of folks who live in India have access to buildings that have air conditioning in one of the hottest places in the world. And so we know as they develop that they will continue to add solutions like air conditioning that will use electricity that, again, will impact our global carbon budget. So because the United States has a higher development, it's incumbent upon us to do more than a 50% reduction. Next slide. And so we've done an analysis ethically. We took a look at about 140 local governments around the country and said, what would it take for the US, for a US local government to do its fair share to hit a global goal of 50% reduction by 2030 and zero by 2050. And what we found in those 140 or so local governments is that on a per capita basis, we need to reduce emissions by about 63% by 2030, with an absolute reduction well above 50%. Now, when I saw these numbers, when the staff came back with these numbers, of course, I kind of took a big gulp, like, are you kidding? By 2030, we're going to reduce our emissions by that much. This is ambitious for sure. But the good news is that it is absolutely feasible. Next slide. So in this inventory analysis, we looked at the different types of fuels consumed in different sectors and what emissions needed to look like in order to hit our reduction goals. This is probably a very familiar set of emissions in your community as well, with about 1/3 of local emissions coming from on-road vehicles, and then the rest of the emissions primarily coming from the residential and commercial sector. So these are our high impact actions. Maya mentioned a number of things that you all are doing at the local level as well as the regional level to impact these various sectors. Next slide. So the big three takeaways, I would say, we need to be more ambitious in our goals, right? So we need to get to around a 60% reduction in local greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. The way to do that is through decarbonization of the electricity grid. This is why utilities and state policy is so very important. And then on the buildings and transportation sectors, we need to continue to do as much efficiency work as possible, reducing vehicle miles traveled, reducing energy consumption in our buildings, continuing to add local renewables, and to increasingly work on electrification of both transportation and buildings. That's really the formula, those three things. And in addition, we know that there are opportunities for supporting actions through methane reductions, waste reductions, sustainable food systems, and so forth. Next slide. So how is this landing with some cities around the country and regions? We've, again, put the science-based target methodology in place in 2020. In 2021, we started developing science-based targets for the local and regional governments that we're working with. And then in 2021 and 2022, started to see action at the local level. So you know, some of the feedback that we received initially was, you know, we have a goal that we haven't achieved yet. Why would we put out another goal that's even farther ahead of where our goal is? But we found that there was broad acceptance for being more ambitious and updating our goals and our strategies. So Aspen, for example, they were at a 30% reduction by 2020 and 80% reduction by 2050. They have now adopted a science-based target. Shoreline Washington updated their climate action plan to include equity components, nature-based solutions, and a science-based target. In Hastings-on-Hudson, New York, they declared a climate emergency, and in doing so, also incorporated a science-based target. And in the East Central Florida region, they have expanded their resilience framework to include a science-based target. Next slide. So some of the ways that we support Maya's team and other local governments, again, is helping to calculate this science-based target, provide a high-impact action roadmap, provide the guidance, technical assistance necessary to put the policies in place and to achieve those targets. Next slide. In addition to individual one-on-one support for local and regional governments, we do often have learning cohorts. These are some of the various themes that the cohorts have taken on in the last couple of years. From the region, from the Metro Washington COG region, we provide a seat for one local government in these learning cohorts each year. Manassas will participate this year in the sustainability planning cohort. I want to call out the budget and procurement for climate action cohort. Again, going back to that notion that we know where we need to go, we know how we can get there. Then it's aligning budget, procurement, and your performance management systems to the climate action plan. And so this year we've launched our first budgeting and procurement for climate action learning cohort. We would love to do this at a regional level if there's an interest in doing that at some point in time. And I think it's going to help position the communities that are participating in that cohort to take better advantage of some of the federal funding that is coming your way. Next slide. So next steps, would love to hear from you or from Maya in the future of any additional technical assistance or support that ICLEI can provide. Again, we are working in a number of pathways. Montgomery County has been an active participant in the forestry work that we've been doing. Last December, we were in Montreal for the Global Biodiversity Conference of the Parties, where a new global framework was adopted for protecting biodiversity in nature. We'll be doing more work around that framework in the coming year. And of course, we know that all of you are integrating resilience into your work as well. So thank you very much for having me today, and happy to take any questions you might have now.
Thank you, Angie and Maya. Sometimes I don't know what to say after a presentation that asks for 50% plus. You said 63.4 on a per capita level by 2030, which is basically tomorrow. So we have these conversations though, and we have no alternative other than to have these conversations in a very earnest way. So just out of curiosity, just to start us off in a discussion here, Angie talked about local government learning cohorts and climate budgets, and learning how to converge into a pathway to get actually things done. I'm curious, and we heard about already 3 signatories from a region on Race to Zero, Alexandria, Tacoma, and Washington, D.C., the district. I'm curious how many of our local governments who are represented here in this committee think that they would potentially benefit from a participation in such a cohort. If you want to raise your hands or virtually, I see I can raise my hand already. I see. So you see the screen is filling with hands here. I believe we have something to work on, and I can imagine that CEEPC will be a good place to collect this willingness and see how we channel that towards ICLEI, and we see how we get this rolling. Thank you so much. Now, are there any questions about these cohorts or about the presentation we just heard in general? If I want to go by hands that are remain, Mr. Sclerio, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly.
Dan, that was for you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
It's Sclerio.
Yeah, Sclerio. I just go by Dr. Dan with my students.
Dr. Dan.
2 questions. Thank you very much, Angie. 2 questions. One is, how is ICLEI addressing environmental justice or climate justice in your activities? And then the second is more specific to urban forestry, whether you're working on any initiatives that are kind of emphasizing the co-benefits of climate or carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and or food benefits, or food foraging benefits. Thank you.
Food foraging. Thanks, Dr. Dan, for that question. Appreciate it. Let me take the first one first and say that environmental justice is really a cross-cutting theme throughout our work. And so in our advisory services for local and regional governments, we provide some best practices around community engagement, the principles behind environmental justice, climate equity, et cetera, trying to call out both the benefits and how communities are affected by climate change throughout the climate action planning process, and making sure that that is incorporated into climate action plans. We are currently hiring a climate equity specialist. So if you know anyone who might be looking to join the ICLEI team, I would very much appreciate any referrals that you'd like to send our direction. So we will have a point person who will be responsible for advancing this work throughout the ICLEI network. We also take a lot of examples from other communities across the globe. And this is one of the benefits of being a global network. There are some great examples that are coming in from Europe, from South America, from India, and we're taking those in as well. On the urban forest carbon sequestration, I mentioned the work that Montgomery County did with us on forestry. One of the tools that we have is called LEARN, which is an acronym for Land Emissions and Removals Navigator. And by county, it allows the community to go in and assess the potential of forests and trees to provide carbon sequestration benefits. We actually did some work with the Chesapeake Bay Conservancy last year to update and to provide additional information for communities within the Chesapeake Bay. And so we have a little bit deeper level of data for those communities. So that is a tool that's on our website, free for you all to use. Maya is very familiar with it, and her team can give you some more info on how that works. There is certainly a lot of interest around food systems, both from access to healthy, affordable food in our communities, as well as reducing food waste, because that, of course, has a great methane and greenhouse gas reduction benefit. But honestly, I haven't thought so much about foraging. So thank you, Dr. Dan, for mentioning that. I'll take that back to the team as one we should look into a bit more.
Yeah, I'm happy to say that we just got a grant from Amazon Web Services to develop a foragers forest on our campus. So hopefully, about maybe in a year or two, I'll come back and present to this committee what we have to say about what we learned. Thank you.
I see Mr. Glass's hand up. No? Okay. Are there any other comments? We are almost on time here now. And thank you so much for the presentation. I think we will keep an eye on the issue of the cohorts. I think on the race to zero, we need to accelerate mightily, especially for those who have been following the news as of yesterday or the day before yesterday. I couldn't imagine something that's more urgent than this. Thank you so much for the presentation and the conversation. Last but not least on our agenda, we will turn our attention to some of the recent climate and energy planning activities that are regional, happening here in our region. We'll first hear from Shannon Moore from Frederick County's climate and vehicle plans. And then we'll hear from Mark Cavini of Loudoun County about their new energy strategy. So please hold your questions for when after both speakers have presented. And I am, Ms. Moore, the floor is yours for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk today about our climate and energy action plan for internal government operations, as well as our electric vehicle readiness plan. Next slide. So just a little bit of background about Frederick County, Maryland, and the genesis of our plan. Our county council voted back in July of 2020 to create a climate emergency resolution. And at that time, they adopted goals to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. They also created a community-based climate emergency mobilization work group. That work group spent about a year working on a report. It was mostly community members. They spent about 18,500 hours to produce a climate response and resilience report in August 2021. And then shortly after that, we had a big storm, and we had a school bus that was stuck in an enormous flood and had to be rescued by our DPW with a front end loader. And you can see a picture of that right there. And the children of the director of our procurement and contracting division are in that bus. Next slide. So the county executive and the county council, as a result of this effort, implemented a series of initiatives last year. They created the Division of Energy and Environment, which I am the new director for. They also created the departments of Stormwater and Climate and Energy. And then they created some key climate and energy programs. The first was a climate and energy action plan that I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about. But they also created programs for building energy performance, alternative fuel vehicles, and clean energy, and that includes clean electricity. And as you can see from the conversations that we've had so far today, this really echoes a lot of what is being done nationally as well as in the region. And importantly, we partnered with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments on our effort, and we contracted with them to help us with our internal climate and energy action plan for internal government operations. At the same time we were working on this climate and energy action plan, we were also working on an update to our required hazard mitigation plan. And we were, I think, the first in the state of Maryland to make it a hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. And we did that in concert with our climate planning efforts. And now in 2023, we're releasing our internal climate and energy action plan, as well as some other efforts, including an alternative fuel vehicles plan that includes an electric vehicle readiness plan, as well as a fleet conversion plan. And then on Monday evening, our county executive released recommendations of her transition team, which is another citizen-based effort with 64 recommendations on what this new administration will be working on, and a substantial number of them in the sustainability category relate to our priorities. Okay, next slide. So many of you are kind of familiar with what goes into a climate and energy action plan, but I just wanted to, for those of you that are a little bit newer to it, to give you a simplified graphic. And so basically there's two key elements. One has to do with measuring and reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, and the other one has to do with assessing your risks and vulnerabilities to climate change, and then adopting resilient strategies and adaptation actions. We do this in two areas. One is the Frederick County Government Internal Operations, and then the next one that we're going to be working on is community-wide. And our Climate and Energy Action Plan is finished, and it's being circulated right now for approval by our county executive. The community-wide planning process will start this year. Okay, next slide. So just a little bit about what goes into the greenhouse gas inventory and mitigation analysis for us. Next slide. In Frederick County government, our foundational step obviously was to assess our baseline emissions. We used a 2010 reference case for internal, although we're using 2005 for community-wide to match the rest of the COG region. And for those of you that are new, the Council of Governments has jurisdiction-wide assessments for your community-wide, not only your greenhouse gas emissions, but also your risks and vulnerabilities. So we worked on our internal county government operations and worked on some key drivers of greenhouse gas emissions. So that includes our buildings and energy facilities, energy use, transportation, solid waste, so-called process and fugitive emissions, as well as water and wastewater treatment. And our key findings include that our buildings and facilities emissions are about half of all of our county government emissions, but 89% of all of our emissions are those plus transportation together. We had a greenhouse gas emissions reduction internally of 20% between 2010 and 2018, which was our progress scenario year, and that our county government is about 1.1% of our community-wide emissions. And so the graphics that you have here show the comparison between the main drivers of our greenhouse gas emissions in 2010 and 2008, and then also projections from our 2010 to 2050 reference case emissions with business as usual projections. So like, if we don't do anything new, where are our emissions going to go? And as you can see, they're not going down. All right, next. Our mitigation analysis basically looked at where we have opportunities to reduce our greenhouse gases based on, one, where we're emitting the most greenhouse gases, but also where the greatest opportunity is. So the overall mitigation goal was to identify those opportunities, and we found 12 key ones, and we modeled them 9 of the strategies across the building and transportation sectors. And so this little graphic here just basically lists them. I'm going to show you in the next slide a little bit easier to see how they pan out. Next. All right, so you can see the impact of the mitigation strategies is that we will lower our emissions 62% below our 2010 levels in 2030. So that is a science-based target. 59% lower than our projected business as usual emissions. And the biggest area overall of all of them in that dark blue is renewable electricity. So you're looking at the time series along the bottom, and then you're looking at the reduction volume on the top axis. The next highest is to electrify our fleet. And then we have some other key goals, including electrification or reducing our energy consumption in buildings, expanding telecommuting, and some other areas. Okay, next. So some of the recommendations in these areas for clean energy and procurement and building energy are to improve our building energy management, data management, benchmarking, and retrofitting, to electrify a greater portion of the building load, and to utilize 100% renewable electricity, moving towards large-scale power purchase agreements, and that would include collaboration with regional partners like yourselves. Okay, next. Another strategy, and you can see one of our electric buses here, is to plan for our clean fleet transition, to use alternative fuels like biofuels, and to reduce our employee commute, which was a surprisingly large portion of our internal government emissions. And I'm not talking a whole lot about what we've already done here because I don't have enough time. I'm just talking about plans in the hopes that this might be useful to some of you. Okay, next. All right, so the next part of this Climate and Energy Action Plan is our risk and vulnerability assessment and the resilience strategy recommendations. Next. And so our projections are pretty dire, as you can see in the top right graph. We're looking at having over 190 days a year by 2070 in a high emissions scenario over 90 degrees. And that's just kind of almost impossible to imagine. And if you look at the number of 100-degree days that we're projecting to have, these are going to pose risks to many of our population, particularly people who work outside and those that live in vulnerable communities where they don't have adequate air conditioning. And so we're looking at increased average temperatures and extreme heat days, but also increased risks of drought, increased year-to-year precipitation variability. We are kind of generally looking at the same amount of precipitation, but in less events that are more intense, and a greater risk of inland flooding and more extreme winter conditions. All right, next slide. So the results of our risk and vulnerability assessment include high heat, priority risks for flooding that could interrupt county services, negative impacts to human health, and a need for backup power. So these are some areas that we need to become more resilient in. Next slide. So our resilience strategies are in 14 key areas that they address our risks specifically for Frederick County. So where if you were in Annapolis, you would have more of a flooding risk. And if you were in the tidal areas, you would have that risk. Our risks are more specific to our particular region. And you can look at both the NOAA Hazard Explorer as well as the risk and vulnerability report from COG to kind of see where your risks are for your own jurisdiction. We have multi-hazard risks, so we need to make sure that our efforts are equitable and support environmental justice, that we're updating codes and ordinances to be more climate informed, that we're monitoring and aware of our green infrastructure and the role that it plays. For example, our forests reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in Frederick County by 18%, but they also reduce flooding significantly. We need to build resilience considerations into budgeting. That was something that our ICLEI folks just mentioned and that we're working on in Maryland. And to develop and adopt indicators and interdivision collaboration mechanisms to address climate resilience measures over time, and to install generators and backup power at critical facilities. And so one of the things that we're doing is working on a microgrid proposal for our 200,000 square foot facility that includes our 911 data center, as well as some other critical operations. Next slide. From a flooding perspective, we need to do more mapping and to understand our flood vulnerabilities more, and we're working with our emergency management folks on that hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan implementation, build overall resilience to stormwater flooding, protect our assets, and increase the resilience of our infrastructure to flood-related damage, as well as understanding and reducing the risk of water contamination. Next slide. From a heat perspective, we have to protect our human health from extreme heat and increase the resilience of our county infrastructure to extreme heat. We talked about equity populations and people who work outside, but our infrastructure, like our roads, are also affected by heat. For example, our pavement patching. Right, next. Sorry, the slide is a little weird in terms of the fonts. I was having some font issues. I tried to fix them, but the impacts of climate change are not distributed equally. And I just wanted to put a note out there that sustainability is for everyone and that we're partnering with citizens and stakeholders to develop equity-driven climate responses. Next slide. And that includes community-focused climate action. So the CEAP for internal operations addresses equity impacts, but we're also working on a community-wide CEAP that is going to be driven through an extensive public practice and equity-driven. Next. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is this is a separate product that we worked on with the Council of Governments and ICF, and that is an alternative fuel vehicle fleet transition plan. And I'm going to try to go through this quickly because I don't want to go too far over time here. Next slide. But I think this is exciting. And, you know, this is the next step as far as meeting the goals of our climate and energy action plan, which is to become more specific about how we're going to do each of these things, right? So the first thing we did with our fleet was to do a right sizing assessment. Next slide. And that really looks at, you know, where we have vehicles that maybe are underutilized or not being utilized at all. You'd be surprised how many of those might be sitting around. So vehicles that have 0 annual miles or below average annual miles were flagged. And we looked at specific departments as a priority for that. And I'm going to note that we worked with 15 different divisions at the county to put this climate and energy action plan together, all told. And we worked very closely with our fleet management office on this particular part of our plan. Next. Electrification assessment. So the next part of it, next slide, is to look at which vehicles are well suited for electrification. We evaluated 876 vehicles for on-road light, medium, and heavy duty. We looked at vehicles that were phased out for retirement because they would have to be replaced. So we were putting them into the regular replacement schedule. And we were doing it based on electric vehicle model availability as far as what we knew when we started the study. And we looked at total costs of ownership scenarios, 5% above existing and 10% above existing costs for purchase. Although, as you'll see as I go a little bit further on, the actual costs are reduced by implementing the EV plan. We did consider some financial incentives that were known, although we anticipate additional incentives that are not included in this analysis. And we used our existing fuel prices. So the vehicles we looked at were light duty pickups, we excluded light duty pickups, heavy straight trucks, and police vehicles for now from the assessment because of use case issues, but they will likely be part of a future analysis. Okay, next slide. So here's some kind of a summary of all of our electrification recommendations by vehicle type, the number of vehicles we evaluated, and the quantity we identified for electrification. All told, there were 235 vehicles that met the use case and had vehicles that were suitable for replacement. And we suggested recommending 189 of them at the 10% TCO scenario. Next. The kinds of vehicles that we were looking at replacing with, and these aren't necessarily hard and fast, it's just what's on the market today. So for example, for shuttle buses, there's a Ford E-Transit van or an SEA electric Ford F650. Heavy trucks, there's a Tesla Semi. Minivan, there's a Canoe Lifestyle. So for each one of these vehicle types that had a suitable replacement that meet our use cases, for example, the number of miles we have to travel in a day and the amount of weight we have to carry, we were able to put those into the model. Next. So here's a little graphic that just shows you in each year how many vehicles we're planning to replace and of what type. And as you can see, it kind of starts to peter out by 2031. And that's just because this plan only goes a certain distance. And then with the models that we have available today. But we expect, as you know, every year we're going to have more models available. And so we'll have to continually update this plan to keep it fresh. So we have basically a good plan through 2030. Next slide. So some overall kind of takeaways for this from us, and this is with the 10% total cost of ownership increase, is that we'll actually save $12 million over a 25-year time frame. We'll save about $6.6 million just in fuel and save about $4.6 million in maintenance and reduce our metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions by about 18,000 MTCO2e. And that's converting 189 vehicles. And so obviously that's only a portion of our fleet. And so we can do a lot more than that over time. Next. We also had biodiesel recommendations. Next slide. We looked at a B20. So we didn't recommend any of the diesel vehicles that were not recommended for conversion to electric vehicles. We looked at for B20. We did not do fire and rescue vehicles this year, but we did look at an adoption year of 2024 for B20, and we found 116 vehicles that could potentially be eligible for B20. Next slide. We found that with the B20, we could save about $116,000 per year in fuel costs. B20 is actually cheaper than regular diesel fuel. We could also save about 433 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions, which is equivalent to about 55 homes' energy use for a year or planting 7,000 trees. Next. One last thing I want to tell you all about is our electric vehicle readiness plan, and we are participating in COG's electric vehicle work group, and we'll be putting the results of these plans up as soon as they're finished. They're in draft form right now. We have comments back to the consultants, and we will be finalizing them and sending them to the county executive for signature soon. And as soon as she signs off on them, we'll post them so that everyone can use them. And our goal is for this EVRP to be able to be used region-wide for your own templating. Next slide. So in 2018, transportation, as I noted before, was about 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and that's also community-wide in Frederick County. And we're doing this plan in partnership with COG and ICF. And we comprised a stakeholder advisory group of our representatives from our Frederick Health Hospital, community college, public school system, local colleges and universities, the city of Frederick, Fort Detrick, our utility, a large employer, Ryan Homes, and others, in order to get their feedback about their own electric vehicle infrastructure needs and their interpretation of the needs of the community. Next. So this EVRP that we did is a standalone plan. It considers the electric vehicle charging needs and infrastructure needs for county residents, workforce members, and visitors to the county as EV adoption increases and as funding opportunities are announced. And it reviews existing EV infrastructure and the deployment of vehicles in the community. It looks at community organizations' interests, needs, and experiences related to EV readiness, including equity considerations through the stakeholder advisory group meetings. And this SAG, I think, is going to be really useful to us in the future for other things. For example, the new EV infrastructure grant, we may be able to advertise to them for a potential community-wide co-op. So I think that this thing has legs. It helps us to identify priorities and opportunities for public and private investment in EV charging infrastructure that will meet the community's EV charging needs. And it discusses EV technology installation and maintenance considerations. And there's a lot of things that maybe we haven't dealt with before if we haven't had EV infrastructure or if we've only had a few EV chargers that start to become much bigger issues like interoperability and things that we're going to be looking at not only at the county government level, but also at the region-wide level as far as standardization. We also look at policies, zoning codes, permitting, inspection codes, accessibility recommendations, and new construction development conditions to promote electric vehicle readiness, and then identify available funding sources and incentive programs, which we've been compiling and will be sharing with the EV work group. And those resources are out there now. And then we put together a case study for one of our planning regions. Okay, next slide. So that's the end of my presentation. I just wanted to show you a picture of my team and my staff who have been working together on these and other efforts related to our climate and energy action plan and our sustainability work. And I thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you. Thank you. Moving ahead with Mr. Avini.
Thank you. Good morning. Mark Avani, Department of General Services, Loudoun County, Virginia. Just as a side note, I'm also the vice chair of the BEAC, which is the Built Environment and Energy Advisory Committee of COG. I do want to give a shout out to both COG and ICF, which has helped us a whole lot with our energy strategy. So getting right into it, I'm going to talk about a couple things today. Next slide, please. We have a overall energy strategy that was just approved by the board last month. It has 3 broad goal areas, 10 general strategies, and 31 specific action templates. It does begin to address energy equity, and I'm going to talk about some important considerations and final thoughts. Next slide. All great plans begin with a vision. We started back in July of 22. We had first ever Loudoun County Environment and Energy Summit, where we talked about a lot of the goals and aspirations that the community had, that the board had, that staff felt was reasonable. We looked at what Virginia is doing in terms of our net zero emissions by 2045 and a carbon-free grid by 2050. We wanted to be sure that whatever we do, the energy has to be clean, reliable, and affordable. Obviously, we always need quantitative and qualitative goals. And because of all the changes that we've recently had in Virginia, we wanted to make sure that we could flex between the Virginia Clean Economy Act and RGGI and things that might change in that regard. Next slide. So on a fairly short time frame, again, with a lot of help from COG and from our contractor ICF, We started framing discussions back in 2022. We do have the advantage here in Loudoun of an environmental commission. This is a board-appointed commission that looks at energy, sustainability, and environmental issues and provides recommendations to the board. They've been very helpful to us in terms of outreach, getting community input, and to just give some subject matter and citizen stakeholder input into the process. So you can see it was a very public process. We were constantly in front of the Environmental Commission or the board or the public to February 21st, where we had final strategy adoption. Next slide, please. We too have our greenhouse gas charts from COG, and if you look at ours is a little different than our friends in Maryland who just went. You can see on the left-hand side, our greenhouse gas emissions are dominated predominantly by buildings. And as you would imagine, Loudoun County, a growing community, we've got lots of residents, we've got lots of data centers, we've got lots of buildings, commercial, retail, and that kind of dominates our greenhouse gas emissions that we're dealing with. We are less so on transportation. You can see the blue here is decidedly less than you might have in other communities. When you move over to the right, which is known as the waterfall graphic, it shows what we have to do. And clearly, we've got a growing population. We've got increased commercial square footage for our data centers, for our businesses. And so this kind of points at what we need to do. We also, though, have 3 metro stations. Silver Line just opened a couple months ago, which is exciting. And we have a lot of opportunities to use that to further reduce our transportation greenhouse gas emissions. So next slide. We also have a business as usual greenhouse gas emission chart, which doesn't look too good, as you would imagine, if we don't do anything. But this does show relative percentages of where we need to focus our efforts. Obviously, commercial is the big one here, but transportation and residential are also included. And so really, next slide, this indicates that we've all got a role to play in energy and greenhouse gas emissions in Loudoun County. We really like this simple graphic here that shows the 3 areas we're focusing on in our energy strategy, leading by example with our county government operations, clean energy development in the county, and then the third and arguably the most important, getting the community, which the government obviously doesn't control, to participate as well. So we developed our energy strategy based on these 3 broad goal areas. Next slide, please. So again, modeling results show that if we do the things that are in the strategy, and I'm going to talk about some of those as well, and you will see that we will reduce by about 56% by 2050 the greenhouse gas emissions from Loudoun County for all of those areas that we talked about. Of great interest to us is the area on the bottom of the graph that shows future efforts, future technologies. There may be, because our strategy goes out to 2050, there may be opportunities in the future to spend more money and to do more things. And so that's recognized in that area below. Next slide, please. So the way we kind of set ours up, which I really like because we're kind of practical here, is you've got this large goal area that says government by example. Great. And then we've got some strategies, like other strategies we've heard that talk about increasing county renewable energy use and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and fleet and all this. In Loudoun, the big player is the landfill. Our landfill is where most of our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. Overall, the county is about 2% of the total, but it is an important example to the community. So we focused a lot on our landfill. We're also focusing a lot on our CIP process, our process every year where we go and build new buildings and do things because we believe that we can become a lot more energy efficient by updating the way we build new buildings and so forth, and just make it part of our standard practice. And then if you go to the next slide, we developed kind of action templates for every action. And what we like about this is that it allows us to pull out a specific action and say we really want to focus, or the board or the community or the money, the grant specifically is for on-site solar at select facilities. We can pull that out. We can see who the lead implementer is. We can see who we need to work with. And then it tells us how to begin our next steps. So we've done these for each of the actions that are in our energy strategy. Good news, the board approved, our Loudoun board approved by straw vote, so it's not the final vote, to fully fund the energy strategy and work plan over $1 million in the new fiscal year so that we can begin implementing this strategy. And someone mentioned somewhere about the difference between a strategy and implementation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in lessons learned, in that strategies are well and good, as everybody knows. Plans are a great thing. They sit on shelves, they sit on websites. It's only when you start implementing them that action really occurs. So we're very pleased that we not only got funding to do a strategy, but now it appears we're getting funding to begin to implement it. So next slide, please. So goal area 2, which is how we support clean energy development in the county, similar to what we heard from our friends in Frederick. We're looking at PPAs, net metering, maybe green zones. We're looking at a lot of different ways that we can get more clean energy development in the county. If you go to the next one, this is a template that talks about how we get the community to adopt on-site renewables. There's a lot of partners to work with. We're very fortunate here in Loudoun that we've got a lot of groups, and I just want to call some out by name because they've been very helpful to us. EC is our environmental commission. I mentioned them already. We've got a very active chamber here. In fact, the largest in Virginia that we've worked with. We've got a great economic development department, which typically works to bring businesses in, but they've also been very interested in working with us. We've got HOAs. We have a lot of private groups such as Solarize Nova that work a lot to get solar panels on houses. So there's a lot of different players at work here that can help us, and we're taking full advantage of that. The board recently adopted the CEEPC program here in Virginia, that we can use that as an incentive for our businesses to do many of these improvements and receive low-cost funding and credit to do that. As I mentioned, we've worked with the Chamber of Commerce to develop kind of an engagement and outreach partnership that's proving to be very, very fruitful. And then we're in the middle of a zoning rewrite, so what a great time to make sure that any existing barriers to do things for on-site renewables are addressed. So a lot of things are happening at a good time. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the big one is stimulating community-wide action. There's just so many things to do here and so many places to start. We too are looking at, zero emission vehicles in the county and how we begin to implement them into our fleet and how we get the charging infrastructure out there. We are very interested in leveraging some of the money from the federal government that's going to be coming down and making that directly available to our residents. And so we're looking at programs with the chamber, with HOAs, with different nonprofits that we could get folks and say, hey, here's how you can get money directly off the cost of a used EV. And we're looking at possible partnerships with the Chamber of Commerce and auto dealerships and so forth, how we might facilitate, some of that. And really just be a clearinghouse, because we've noticed that as far as energy equity, some folks are perhaps a little more timid about working with the government. There might be language barriers, there might be other barriers. And so how do we facilitate access to say, here's how you get some of that money, here's how you do some of these things, and working maybe with some non-traditional partners, people we haven't necessarily, worked with before. So we're obviously very excited about this and how we might develop some energy equity efforts. Next slide, please. And here's just an example of an action template. We do have an equity officer here in Loudoun. We do have a lot of faith-based communities and community groups that we can work with. We're currently meeting and talking to folks on how we do ensure equity across all these different populations. The one thing that I've learned is that you all probably already knew, but I'm a little newer to this, is you don't want to assume. You want to go out into communities, into places and say, hey, what would be helpful to you? The government is thinking about doing this. Is this really what you need? Is this helpful? And to kind of get some of that feedback and see what might be most the best way to pursue some of this IRA funding. So we're kind of moving ahead on that. Next slide, please. We too are going to have a nice looking report, and we're going to put it on the website, and everybody's going to go there and read it and say, oh, what a great document. And this will guide our efforts as we move forward into the coming years. We intend, and we've told the board, that we want to update it on a regular basis. And it's always a good opportunity to get in front of the governing body to let the public know, what we're doing and how we're doing it, and looking for feedback. So we're very excited to get this approved and official. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the things that we've shared with the board, with the stakeholders. We very much like our strategy. The board liked it too. The community liked it too. It is a positive and balanced approach that focuses on energy sustainability. We can do more, we can do less. As more money becomes available or as things get tighter, we have the ability to flex, as we like to say. There's a long period of time that we're doing this work. It goes out to 2045, 2050. So we've got a lot of things that we can do over time, and a lot of these efforts, have already begun. We've made it very clear, and as I've said, this is a plan that has fiscal impacts. If we're going to do some of these things, it's going to cost us, more money. And that's been generally acknowledged and well received. I heard, my friend from Maryland talk about multiple departments. Oh, yes, people got tired of me calling because we're developing an energy strategy, but it impacts fleet, it impacts economic development, it impacts zoning. And, I don't know how much you know about local government departments, but some local government departments, certainly not in Loudoun, can be rather siloed. And so you can have some difficulty to people say, wait a minute, why are you asking me about this? Why are you getting into how I manage my facilities? Why are you suggesting a county energy policy that means we can't turn the thermostat up higher than a certain number? So, you deal with a lot of different people and personalities, and that's good. That's good because ultimately at the end of the day, it is about people. But as you know, there's nonprofits, there's community groups. We have a data center coalition here in Loudoun. In fact, we have a data center coalition member on our environmental commission. We've been working with them, and we're looking at doing a pilot program with them. Everybody knows that Loudoun is #1 for data centers in the world. So we've kind of taken the approach of, hey, let's show the world what we can do in terms of energy sustainability and how we might develop a pilot program, how we might look at some of the renewable energy. Many of the corporate websites for data centers state that they're procuring 100% of their energy from some renewable source in another state or in Southwest Virginia. So let's find a way that we can better evaluate that and account for that when we look at greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, as everybody here knows, we need to get the public's input. It certainly does help to have an overall commission, as we have here in Loudoun, that is charged with doing that, because we go there, and we're meeting tonight actually with a subcommittee of the Environmental Commission. These meetings are all public and all available online, and so it's a great help to us as a way to get that feedback. And as I mentioned, we're beginning to look at energy equity and access to some of those federal grants. Next slide, please. No surprise, this is a high touch effort. You're going to talk to a lot of people. You're going to call a lot of people. You're going to have a lot of breakfasts and a lot of lunch and a lot of dinners. And those are all good things because I like all those things. Maybe my waistline doesn't, but the more people that you talk to, the more people that are aware of what you're trying to do, because all of this is good and positive and helps everybody. You just get more participation. You just get, and that's what the board really wants us to do and has tasked us to do. And it's kind of an honor really to do it, because they could have given this to somebody else to do. And so somebody else would be doing all that, coordination. Do want to point out that we always want to be cognizant of the board is the decision-making group in the county. The board is elected to fund efforts. The board can say yay or nay. So whenever we get good ideas, and we get them all the time, we try to couch them in terms of what the board has already seen and approved. So they've approved this energy strategy. Everything in there is fair game. If we want to do something different, when we go back to the board, we say, hey, we might change this a little bit. This one action that you saw based on further input or funding or whatever, We think it might go better like this. We're very sensitive to not getting in front of the board. And well-meaning volunteers, well-meaning commission members will say, we really need to do this, not that. And we're always, sensitive to that. And I think that's why we've been successful. And as I said, a lot of times, strategies, plans, great things. We all need them. But implementation is a separate effort, requires separate funding and a separate plan to do. So in conclusion, then, if we could go to the last slide, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm an email away. If you want to look at what our commission has done, you could go on the county website and look at the Environmental Commission and our webpage. We are trying to get our webpage better, set up some information hubs for energy, for environment, so that information is easier to access and can be looked at with a kind of a GIS platform. So we're working on that as well. But that, in short, Mr. Chairman, is my presentation. I'll be glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark and Shannon. Exciting developments over there in Frederick and in Loudoun. We are coming up to noon, but I see one hand raised, Mr. Freed. I think we have time for 1 or 1.5 questions. Yes.
All right. Well, I've got at least 1.5 questions. I'll lay them out. First, terrific presentations, Maya and Shannon, Mark, and Angie. And I guess it's very clear that there are some common themes that are coming across. I recognize these themes from the Prince William Community Energy and Sustainability Master Plan that we're working on right now. So question 1, it's very clear that a key to success everywhere is ramping up clean electricity. It appears to me that on-site solar is good, but it's not as cost effective as central station solar or wind. So clearly there needs to be a mechanism to procure lots of clean energy and to make it accessible to commercial buildings, to residences, and so forth. So question 1 is, given all of the complexity associated with setting up a community choice program or a municipal aggregation program, and given the importance of making sure that renewable energy would be additional rather than simply diverting clean energy that would be going someplace else anywhere, is there a role for a regional municipal aggregation approach where all of us in all of these counties and DC could tap into a program that would set up maybe a couple of PPAs that would allow cheap, clean electricity? Then question 2 is that it's also clear that VMT reduction is essential for reducing transportation emissions. The region has its visualized 2050 long-range transportation plan coming up. Bill Pugh wrote a terrific op-ed in Greater Washington. I'll send a link to that. But he identifies kind of a key challenge there, which is that the transportation people aren't necessarily talking to the sustainability people. And if we're going to cut our emissions from transportation, we really need to constrain the number of lane miles that get paved. So the other question is, how can we better make that coordination happen? So I'd invite answers from any of the panelists. Thank you very much.
Mr. Freed, that was a little bit more than 1.5 questions for this meeting today. I think that very, very valid questions. And Ms. Rosenberg, I saw your hand. I hope we will have the possibility just for a few seconds to give a very short answer, but I believe the right answer to that is we can answer them offline and Ms. Davis can coordinate to get your questions responded. Mr. Freed, these were also some interesting policy discussion items there embedded in your questions, and I think this merits a longer conversation at some point, which time that we don't have right now. We are 1 minute over noon. I would like to thank our panelists and COG staff for the conversation today and everybody who participated. We will be adjourned shortly until May 24th at 10 a.m. And you know, the big advantage of having COG getting us together is that we have a place where we can exchange our ideas, you know, launch our questions and get them responded in a very, you know, in a very effective way. So with that, and thanking everybody, I am going to adjourn this meeting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.